when I lived in Colorado that there was terrible racism. I had applied for a law school when I was considering law school in Colorado. The admissions person made some comment reference my GPA, which was my undergrad GPA from FIU here in Miami. And I had a 3.92 GPA, and which is summa cum laude. And they said something racist along the lines of, oh, well, a 3.92 GPA in basket weaving is not the same as a normal GPA with normal classes. And I'm like, huh? Like, what? I made a video the other day talking about how I have been experiencing a personal uptick in racist encounters here living in Miami, but I noticed that I've been having them happen to me here a lot more lately, and I can't help but assume or, think that that has to do with a lot of the political tension in the world right now. But since I talked about that, I guess I figured it was a good time to talk about a few year period when I lived in Colorado. I'm from Miami, but I ended up living in Colorado for a few years before ending up moving back to Miami. During that time period that I lived in Colorado, Colorado is supposed to be a very, very progressive place, and in many ways it is very progressive. They tend to be very liberal and progressive. But I also noticed when I lived in Colorado that there was, in my opinion, terrible racism where a boy came up to me and said, "You look like a Mexican, but you don't dress like one," when it pertained to people who were Hispanic. I lived in two different areas primarily when I was in Colorado. One was called Eagle County, and Eagle County encompasses places like Vail and Beaver Creek. It's essentially the resort areas of that area. And you have a lot of locals, and you have locals that are very blue collar, meaning they work, everyday jobs. And then you have locals who have a lot of money who, live in big mountain homes. And then you also have, obviously, people who own properties there as second homeowners. And then I also lived for about a year in Denver. There was a huge amount of racism that I encountered when I lived in Colorado. I remember I had someone who was associated with the school system there. He made a comment that he could see me being a janitor. The general person in Colorado seems to be very hardworking. They seem to be very familial. Family is important. Working is important. Having a certain level of morals is important. You have a large, Christian population in Colorado. There's a large Mormon population. So it was a little surprising when I would encounter racism in Colorado. It's like in your mind, you just don't think that those two things go together. But there was a lot of ingrained racism in Colorado when it pertained to the Hispanic community, particularly the Mexican community that resided in Colorado. There was a very big divide. You would see it in the education system. One group doesn't want to hang out with the other. Segregation in that sense. A lot of stigmatized, narrow-minded thoughts and comments about people. There was just very, very, very narrow-minded thoughts where they felt essentially anyone who spoke Spanish derived from Mexico, although there's nothing wrong with deriving, obviously, from Mexico. I think there was a very wealthy business owner who lived at the time he lived in Colorado, and I believe he owned one of the hotels, came in and bought one of the resorts there in Vail. His family derived from Mexico, and I remember reading an article that said he was encountering racism in Colorado. There was, bar owners there that were making comments about the Hispanic community. There is a unbelievable amount of, there's a local newspaper there, interestingly enough, was a paper that I was sort of an intern for, and I would write fashion columns for, but where it was like letters to the editor or like these bizarre articles that I could not imagine being here in Miami. One title was like, "You may have heard a lot of Spanish being spoken around town, but it's okay. They're Spanish with money, and they're coming here to help our economy." And just these bizarre titles that I could never imagine that occurring anywhere else. Vail and Beaver Creek, again, is an area that has a lot of wealthy people who are either second homeowners or who moved there. So these are some very, very narrow-minded thoughts that they were allowing to be, that were just prospering there. And it was very surprising for an area that also seemed to have very strong family values. When I lived in our mountain home at the time, we, especially because we started to go back and forth between Miami and here before we moved back, we actually, my family hired a local who also owned a big mountain home there. And we at the time, we were a little bit more affluent and we lived on this very nice street. And he was another homeowner, and we hired him to do like where he was a house manager for our home. And he was making comments about me, and he was like, I always thought you were Hispanic or something like that. Weird comments. And when we were going over like what to pay him an hour and things like that, you know, he wanted, you know, an excessive amount of money. He wanted like $30 an hour or something like that to basically come in your house and make sure that there was not a leak. You know, he did very, very little when it came to our home. Towards the end, when we moved, he did a little bit more, you know, overseeing, you know, movers and stuff like that. But he did very, very little. And he would make comments like, when we mentioned a lower amount, he's like, I'm not going to get paid that. I'm not a Mexican. It's like the racism was very, very ingrained, unfortunately. And this was coming from a guy who owned a big mountain home. He was wealthy. I remember I had someone who was associated with the school system there. He made a comment that he could see me being a janitor. Very, very racist comments. And that was unfortunate. He was a part of the school system at the time. There were teachers and instructors there who were part of the school system, and they were making anti-Semitic comments. I remember this was years ago. This is when I lived there for a few years. Just certainly very, very bizarre stuff. I remember my dad and me, we would go all the time, almost daily, to Wendy's. And the Wendy's in this area of Eagle County was they owned a few Wendy's, like a franchise where they owned a few of them. And the family itself that owned them was very, very nice. They were very liberal. They were very progressive. They were just a very, very nice family. Most of their employee base was Hispanic, and they had a particular employee who at the time was a manager. And again, don't, you know, think badly of the business. Like, this was many, 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 many years ago. There was a manager at the time who was in one of the restaurants, and he was just not getting along with the Mexican employee base that was working at this particular franchise location. He was making, you know, the typical racist comments you expect someone like that to make, you know, speak English, all that. And this family found out about it, and they fired him, which was the correct thing to do. And they even made a statement like, absolutely unacceptable. I remember talking to them about it. Not that I was the one that brought it to their attention. It's just like I happened to be eating there, and they were there, and they were talking about it openly. There was a woman at the time who was one of their employees. I think she may have been an assistant manager at the time. I think they ended up making her manager, and then I think they actually promoted her to like a regional position to oversee all their restaurants. And she was a very unusual, good soul. I remember at the time, you know, I was much younger, and she would see me there eating all the time with my dad. I remember she gave us like a free Christmas dinner at Wendy's. She would always talk to us. She was very nice. I remember she was like, if ever you need a job, you know, you could always come here for a job. It was just, she was a sweet soul, and it shows that there's good people, you know, even amongst adversity. But it was a very surprising thing, because you would not expect to be facing that type of racism in such a progressive place. I mean, a lot of people in the comments may come back and say, well, you got racism everywhere. But it was particularly strange, because you wouldn't think of a place like Colorado, and it was so ingrained. Like, it was very, very, very ingrained. I mean, they've had issues there with some of the universities. Had a racist driver's license experience. I went to a place called Glenwood, which was known as like, you know, they have a racist history there, because that's where the DMV was located. The woman, as soon as I got there, she said hello to a girl she knew from the community, and I could just tell it wasn't going well, and she looked me up and down. She said I had to yield to imaginary people. It was very, very bizarre. I ended up having to go to Denver to a private tester in order to get my driver's license. But yeah. What are you talking about? I took statistics. I took normal hard courses, international relations and everything, and they're like, so the fact that they would make a comment and allude to FIU and Miami as your courses are the equivalent of basket weaving just shows where their head is at. And I actually remember I actually reported them to some sort of internal board for racism, and it came back within like 20 minutes, like there was no review. Within 20 minutes, we don't see anything wrong that they did. And that was the type of situation where you would have to get involved, actually formally reporting them to, you know, something that oversees racism, you know, Department of Justice. And you know how it is today. Everything is like, can take, you know, a very long time. It's just better to be like, oh, I would never go there, obviously. And I'm glad I don't live in Colorado. The weather's getting particularly bad, so that's why I'm actually filming on my balcony. But I'm glad right now I live in Miami. There's obviously issues here too. And I feel like I'm gonna start to make more videos on Miami and the things I know, because they always say with blogging especially, you should make blogs on something you know, and Miami is something that I obviously know very well. But those are my thoughts so far. I'm sure there's a lot more I could say, but thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to run inside because this storm is scaring me, and I'm gonna go inside and eat cake. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon in my next video, and bye!